Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling something we all experience but rarely examine closely: citizenship.
It's fascinating how much it shapes our lives without us even realizing it.
Exactly. So, we're going to really dissect it, look at how it functions, both when things are peaceful and when conflict arises.
Right. And we've got a lot of interesting perspectives to draw on for this.
We've got some academic theories, some historical examples, even some pop culture sprinkled in there.
Yeah, we're really trying to get a full picture of this concept.
Okay, so let's start with what might seem like an easy question. What is citizenship?
Hmm. Well, I think a lot of people would probably jump to the legal stuff first, like having a passport, voting, that kind of thing.
Right, like the tangible markers.
Exactly. And legally speaking, a lot of countries define citizenship in two main ways. Just PSI, which is basically right of the soil.
So, like in Canada, if you're born here, boom, you're a citizen, most likely.
Yeah, that's it. And then there's just sanguinis, which is right of blood.
So, even if you weren't born in Canada, but one of your parents, is Canadian, you could still claim citizenship.
Exactly. But then things get a bit trickier when we start talking about naturalization. That's where someone applies to become a citizen.
Oh, yeah. Like, what are the rules around that? Who gets accepted? Who doesn't?
Right. And sometimes those rules bump up against real-life situations where the human element gets complicated.
Like the case of Mavis Baker in Canada, right?
Oh, that was a tough one. She was facing deportation, even though her kids, who she was raising, were Canadian citizens.
And that really sparked debate about where the legal line ends, and you have to start considering compassion, right?
Yeah, exactly. And different countries handle this whole question differently. Like the U.S. has had huge debates about what happens to children of undocumented immigrants.
Oh, yeah. That's been a big one in the States for sure. And then there's the curveball, multiple citizenships. Can you really be a citizen of more than one country at the same time?
Right. What happens when loyalties get divided?
Like, think about those Lebanese Canadians during the 2006 war. They had ties to both countries. Suddenly, a conflict puts them in a really difficult spot.
Yeah, it really challenges our assumptions about where we belong and what citizenship truly means.
So it's clear, even just looking at the legal side, citizenship is already more complex than you'd think at first glance. But then our sources also point to this whole other idea: citizenship as a moral project.
Hmm. Yeah, that gets into a whole other dimension. It's less about the paperwork and more about action.
So it's not enough to just hold rights. You have to use them to make things better, basically.
Exactly. Like the Canadian Policy Research Networks, they talk about citizenship having three parts. Rights, sure, but also access and belonging.
And didn't the philosopher John Ralston Saul say that voting is like the bare minimum?
Mm,
Real citizenship demands way more than that.
that's right. He was pretty adamant about that.
So if we're moving past just the legal stuff, how does that change how we think about, like, being a citizen? How do we put this moral project into action?
Well, there are tons of ways people do this, even when there's no big conflict going on, like going to town hall meetings, protesting if there's something they disagree with, volunteering, donating to causes.
Yeah, it can be big stuff or small stuff, right?
Exactly. It's about being engaged with your community, trying to make things better.
And people definitely differ in how much they take that on, right? Some folks might just do the basics. Others are out there trying to change the world every day.
Mm-hmm. Like that whole me to we philosophy.
Oh, yeah, like how our individual actions can ripple outwards.
Exactly. Even small choices can impact people all over. It's about moving past just thinking about ourselves and considering how we fit into the bigger picture.
Okay, so that's citizenship in more peaceful times. But things obviously get a lot more complicated when we throw conflict into the mix.
Yeah, that's where things get really intense. And we've got two really powerful historical examples to look at: the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the Vietnam War.
Those are stories of incredible resilience, people fighting for what they believe in, and facing some really tough situations.
So let's start with South Africa. Apartheid was brutal. It was this system of racial segregation and discrimination.
I mean, we know a little about it, but can you give us the context?
Yeah, so basically, the white minority, which was under 20% of the population, they had control over pretty much everything: politics, the economy, even where people could live.
Yeah, I remember learning about the pass laws, how people couldn't even move freely within their own country.
Exactly. And just to give you a sense of the inequality, in 1978, the white minority controlled 87% of the land and received 75% of the national income.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that level of disparity. So how did people start to resist? Who were the main groups involved?
Well, two key organizations emerged: the African National Congress, or ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, the
Well, they
PANTO.
had different approaches, right?
They did. The ANC had a more inclusive vision, aiming to dismantle the system for all non-white groups. The PACE, they were focused specifically on black power.
So how did they go about fighting apartheid?
Both groups initially focused on nonviolent resistance. Things like boycotts, strikes, peaceful demonstrations.
But I imagine the government didn't just sit back and let that happen.
Oh, definitely not. The government responded with intense repression. One of the most horrific examples of this was the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960.
Oh, right. I've heard of that. But refresh my memory.
So it was a peaceful protest against the pass laws, and the police just opened fire on the crowd, killed 69 people, wounded almost 200.
It's hard to believe that kind of brutality could happen, especially against unarmed people.
It was a turning point for sure. The world really started to see just how bad things were in South Africa.
And I imagine this pushed both the ANC and PATI to rethink their tactics.
It did. They started to believe that armed struggle might be necessary. And this is where Nelson Mandela's role becomes really important.
Oh, yeah, of course, Mandela.
He was initially all about nonviolence. But as the state got more violent, he came to believe that armed resistance was the only way.
And then, of course, he was arrested in '62 and imprisoned for 27 years.
Right, which really solidified him as this global symbol of resistance. Even from prison, his words carried immense weight.
And during his trial in 1964, he gave that incredible speech, right? The one where he said, "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people."
Yeah, that one. He talked about fighting against both white and black domination, how he believed in a democratic and free society where everyone had equal opportunities.
And he ended with that powerful line, "It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die."
Yeah, it was really powerful. And as the world started condemning apartheid more and more, things began to shift.
Look, I remember learning about the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa, companies pulling out, they were getting isolated.
Exactly. And by the late 80s, it was pretty clear that apartheid wasn't sustainable anymore. The government finally started dismantling the system, and in 1990, Mandela was released from prison.
That was a huge moment, not just for South Africa, but for the whole world.
It was.
Mhm.
And in 94, they had their first free and fair elections, with Mandela becoming the first black president.
Mm.
It was the culmination of decades of struggle and sacrifice.
But I imagine the transition wasn't easy. Those scars don't just disappear.
No, they don't. There were still so many deep divisions, so much pain and resentment from the past.
And how did they try to address that?
They created something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC.
Oh, yeah, that was a pretty unique approach.
It was. Instead of focusing on punishment, it was more about healing. Victims could share their stories. Perpetrators could confess their crimes.
I remember it was a very controversial process. Some people felt like it let perpetrators off too easily.
Yeah, there were definitely criticisms. But for a lot of people, it was a necessary step towards moving forward as a nation.
And even today, South Africa is still dealing with the aftermath of apartheid, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are still huge inequalities, systemic racism. It's a reminder that the work for justice and equality never really ends.
So we see how citizens fought for their rights in South Africa. Now, let's move on to a different conflict that really shook things up, especially in the U.S., the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that one was a major turning point. A long, costly war that ultimately ended in defeat for the U.S.
And it gave rise to this massive anti-war movement that changed how Americans viewed their role as citizens.
Absolutely. It's a story about the power of dissent, the complexities of war, and the enduring struggle for peace and justice.
Yeah.
It really challenged the whole narrative of this noble fight for freedom and brought the human cost of war into sharp focus.
Yeah, suddenly it wasn't some abstract thing happening overseas. It was in your living room every night.
Exactly, and that had a huge EG impact on public opinion. People started questioning the government's justifications for being there, demanding answers.
And this was all happening against the backdrop of some pretty major social and cultural upheaval in the 60s, right? I mean, that was a time of questioning everything.
Oh, totally. The civil rights movement, women's liberation, the counterculture, they were all pushing for change, questioning traditional authority.
And the anti-war movement was fueled by that energy, right?
Absolutely. It was all connected. People were realizing that injustice wasn't limited to just one area of life.
So who are some of the key players in the anti-war movement? Who was really driving this?
Well, it was a really diverse coalition, but one group that stands out is the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. They were organizing protests, rallies, teach-ins, anything to raise awareness about what was happening in Vietnam.
And they were pretty vocal in their criticism of the war and U.S. foreign policy in general.
Yeah, they didn't hold back. In 65, their president, Paul Potter, gave this incredible speech. He basically said that the Vietnam War had shattered any illusion that the U.S. acted based on morality or democracy.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
It was. And the civil rights movement was also becoming increasingly intertwined with the anti-war movement.
Oh, right, because leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. started speaking out against the war as well.
Yeah, he saw a direct connection. He argued that the war was draining resources that could be used to address poverty and inequality at home.
And he famously said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death."
Exactly. He saw the war as a moral failing, a betrayal of America's commitment to justice.
So as the war dragged on and the death toll kept rising, this anti-war movement just kept gaining momentum.
Oh yeah, the protests got bigger and more frequent. In 69, there was this massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of thousands of people marching for peace.
That must have been pretty powerful to witness.
Oh, absolutely. And it had a real impact. I mean, the anti-war movement contributed to President Johnson's decision not to seek re-election in 68, and it definitely played a role in Nixon's eventual decision to withdraw troops in 73.
So the Vietnam War, even though it ended in defeat for the U.S., it really did have a lasting impact on American society, on how people viewed their role as citizens.
For sure. It raised all these fundamental questions about the nature of war, the limits of power, the responsibility of citizens to hold their leaders accountable.
And it showed that even in a democracy, people have the power to challenge their government, to demand change.
Absolutely. The Vietnam War is a reminder that citizenship isn't passive. It's about engagement, speaking out, fighting for what you believe in.
And we see that same spirit of active citizenship in how Canada responded to the war, even though they weren't directly involved in the fighting.
Oh yeah, Canada became a haven for American draft dodgers and war resistors.
Yeah.
Thousands of them crossed the border seeking refuge.
So even though Canada officially supported U.S. policy, there was this whole other undercurrent of dissent and opposition to the war.
Yeah, it was complicated. And it really shaped Canada's identity as this more peaceful, welcoming nation, a place that offered an alternative to the conflict.
And it sparked all these debates about what it means to be Canadian, what values the country should stand for.
Exactly. And that brings us closer to the present, to Canada's involvement in the war in Afghanistan.
Right, which began after 9/11 and lasted for over a decade.
And that was another conflict that deeply divided Canadians.
I mean, I remember it being pretty controversial.
It was. Some people supported the mission as part of the fight against terrorism, seeing it as an obligation to international security.
And others opposed it, arguing that it was an unwinnable war that would only lead to more suffering.
Yeah, there were a lot of strong opinions on both sides.
And just like with Vietnam, Canadians weren't passive observers. They took to the streets, organized protests, engaged in public debate.
Exactly. It shows that these questions about citizenship, about our responsibilities in times of war and conflict, they're ongoing. They don't have easy answers.
Okay, so we've looked at these big historical events, how they shaped ideas about citizenship. But our sources also highlight a bunch of individual stories, people who took action in their own way to make a difference.
Yeah, and those stories are really powerful. They remind us that citizenship isn't just about grand gestures or political movements. It's also about the choices we make every day.
It's about finding those moments where you can step up, even in small ways, and make a difference.
And sometimes those small actions can ripple outwards and have a much bigger impact than you might expect.
Like in the case of Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the American athletes who raised their fists in a Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics.
Yeah, that image is iconic. It was this incredibly powerful act of defiance on a global stage.
And they faced huge backlash for it. They were suspended from the U.S. Olympic team, sent home in disgrace.
But their actions also sparked a conversation, inspired others to stand up against racial injustice. It shows that even when you face consequences, speaking truth to power can have a lasting impact.
Their story definitely makes you think about what you'd be willing to risk for your beliefs.
For sure. And then there's the case of Adam Werbach, who went from being the youngest ever president of the Sierra Club.
That's a pretty big deal, leading a major environmental organization like that.
It is. But then he went and took a job as a consultant for Walmart, a company that's often criticized for its environmental practices.
Oh, wow, that must have caused quite a stir.
Yeah, some people saw it as a total sellout.
But I guess he had his reasons.
He did. He argued that working within the system, even a system he might disagree with, could actually be more effective than just shouting from the outside.
Hmm. That's an interesting perspective. Like, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty if you want to make real change.
Exactly. And it highlights the complexities of activism. It's not always a clear-cut path.
Speaking of complexities, there's also the story of the Dixie Chicks, the country music group.
Oh yeah, they faced massive backlash when they spoke out against the Iraq War.
What happened exactly? I vaguely remember it being a big deal.
Well, they were on tour in London in 2003, and during a concert, Natalie Maines, the lead singer, told the crowd that they were ashamed that the President of the United States was from Texas.
Oh, wow, that's pretty direct, especially for a country music group.
Yeah, it didn't go over well with a lot of their fans. Radio stations stopped playing their music. They got death threats. Their careers basically took a nosedive.
I guess it shows the risks of speaking out, especially for celebrities, people who have this big platform.
Definitely. It raises all these questions about free speech, about the consequences of dissent, especially during wartime.
And in the age of social media, those questions are even more relevant, right? Because anyone can become a public figure overnight and face those kinds of consequences.
That's true. So far, we've talked about people taking these bold, sometimes defiant stands. But our sources also point to individuals who work for change in quieter but equally powerful ways.
Like who?
Well, there's Topora Berman, the Canadian environmental activist.
What did she do?
She dedicated her life to protecting forests. Started as a local activist trying to save old-growth forests on Vancouver Island.
Wow, starting small and local.
Yeah, but she didn't stop there. Her efforts grew into this global campaign. She ended up working with Greenpeace, Forest Ethics, all these big organizations, challenging unsustainable logging practices all over the world.
So it shows that even if you start small, you can build something really significant, create change on a global scale.
It's inspiring, right? And then there's the story of Charlotte Haley, who started making and distributing peach-colored ribbons in the early 90s to raise awareness about breast cancer.
Oh yeah, the pink ribbon. It's become such a ubiquitous symbol.
And that all started with her, just one woman trying to make a difference.
But didn't that whole campaign end up getting co-opted by corporations?
Yeah, it did. The pink ribbon became this huge marketing opportunity, a way for companies to profit off of this very serious disease.
That's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It is. It raises questions about how these movements for social change, even the well-intentioned ones, can sometimes get distorted or manipulated.
It's a reminder to be critical, to always ask questions, to make sure that the causes we support are actually doing what they claim to be doing.
Exactly. And then there's Sam Singh, a filmmaker who co-founded a company called Northgate Productions.
What kind of films do they make?
They focus on social, political, and environmental issues. Their first film, Land Unlocked, was all about the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities.
So he's using his passion for film to raise awareness, to tell stories that matter.
Exactly. It shows that we can use our talents and skills to make a difference in the world, to shine a light on issues that deserve attention.
Yeah, like you don't have to be a politician or an activist to contribute to social change.
You're right. There's so many different ways to get involved.
And finally, there's the story of Simon Jackson, who started campaigning to protect the spirit bear habitat when he was just 13 years old.
That's right. He launched the Spirit Bear Youth Coalition, which now has millions of members in over 65 countries.
It's incredible to see how someone so young could have such a huge impact.
It really shows that age is no barrier to activism. And he truly believes that everyone, regardless of their age or background, can make a difference.
He once said, "It doesn't matter what type of action is taken as long as it is positive. There are no insignificant endeavors, for the sum total of all our acts will be the solutions to our unsolvable problems and our legacy to all life for generations to come."
Yeah, his words are a powerful reminder that every action counts, that we all have a responsibility to do what we can to make the world a better place.
It's amazing to see the impact these individuals had. Really puts things into perspective.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, we started this deep dive asking about how much our ideology should shape our actions as citizens. And looking at these stories, it's clear those ideologies could be a powerful driving force.
Yeah, whether it's fighting for racial equality or protecting the environment, people's beliefs about what's right and wrong can really push them to make a difference.
But like we've seen, ideology can also be a source of division and conflict, even violence. It's like a double-edged sword.
Right, so how do we find that balance? How do we harness the power of ideology for good without falling into those traps?
Well, I think self-awareness is key. Understanding our own biases, Being open to different perspectives, recognizing that most issues are complex and don't have simple solutions.
Now, like being willing to have those tough conversations, to really listen to people who might see the world differently than we do.
Exactly. And ultimately, it comes down to individual choice.
Yeah.
What kind of citizen do you want to be?
Yeah. What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? It can feel overwhelming sometimes, thinking about all the problems out there.
It can. But these stories remind us that you don't have to solve everything at once. It's about finding those areas where you feel passionate, where you can contribute, and starting there.
Like, it could be something as simple as volunteering in your community or donating to a cause you care about.
Or speaking up when you see injustice, educating yourself on important issues, even just being more mindful of your own choices and how they impact others.
Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to making the world a better place.
Exactly. And like Simon Jackson said, there are no insignificant endeavors. It's the collective sum of all our actions that creates real change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into citizenship, we hope you're walking away feeling inspired, maybe even a little empowered.
Because ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide what kind of citizens we want to be. The future really is in our hands.
And we want to thank you for joining us on this exploration of citizenship. We hope it's given you some food for thought, some inspiration, and maybe even a little nudge to step up and make a difference in your own way.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better world.